Here is a country that once ruled one of the largest territories in Europe, and then, for 123 years, it simply ceased to exist. It didn't shrink, it didn't weaken, it vanished. It was wiped from every official map of the continent, its name struck from treaties, its king abolished, its army disbanded by decree. And yet, when the map was finally redrawn, the very same people, speaking the same language and praying in the same churches, returned to the world stage as if they had merely been waiting in the next room. So how does a nation manage to disappear from the map for more than a century and still come back? Let's rewind to the 16th century. Poland back then was nothing like a small fragile state clinging to survival. It was united with Lithuania in one of the largest political unions in Europe, stretching from the Baltic all the way to the Black Sea. This was the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, enormous, wealthy from grain exports. Religiously diverse, at a time when the rest of Europe was busy burning people at the stake for praying the wrong way. On paper, it looked like a future superpower. Now look at those same lands today. Poland is a mid-sized country, roughly the size it was before that empire even formed. Lithuania is a small Baltic state. Ukraine and Belarus are entirely separate nations. Somewhere between that 16th century giant and today's tidy borders, an entire country was wiped off the face of the earth, then had to be rebuilt from scratch. That gap is the central mystery. The engines of catastrophe, geography and politics. Here's the hidden engine behind almost everything that followed. Geography gave Poland no natural walls, no mountain ranges, no wide river barriers, no seas on every side, just a flat, open plain stretching from Germany in the west to Russia in the east. Armies could march across it in any direction without much trouble. Every powerful neighbor eventually came to treat that plain as a highway. But geography alone wouldn't have doomed Poland. The second engine was politics. The Commonwealth built an unusual system. The king was elected by an assembly of nobles, rather than inheriting the throne. For its time, that sounded progressive, and in some ways it was. The nobility gained real political rights centuries before most of Europe did. The problem was a rule called the liberum veto, the free veto. Any single noble, just one person in the National Assembly, the same, could block a law. Not water it down, but kill it outright, and sometimes even shut down the entire session early. Imagine trying to govern a country where any one person in parliament could cancel the whole session, simply because they personally disagreed with something. For a while, this bizarre system held together on goodwill and habit. But as the decades passed, foreign powers realized something extremely useful. You could simply bribe one nobleman to veto any reform that threatened their interests. Poland's own constitution had built in a permanent kill switch for the state, and its neighbors quickly found the button. 3 neighbors in the first partition. While the Polish government slowly froze in place, its neighbors were doing exactly the opposite. Russia was becoming a centralized empire under increasingly ambitious rulers. Prussia, under kings like Frederick the Great, was building one of the most efficient military states in Europe. Austria was expanding Habsburg holdings in the region. 3 rising powers and one large but structurally paralyzed state caught between them. That kind of imbalance couldn't stay stable for long. By the 1760s, the situation was obvious to any observer. Poland couldn't reform its own government fast enough to protect itself, because reform required unanimous approval, and unanimity was very much for sale. Meanwhile, Russian Empress Catherine the Great treated Polish politics almost like her own backyard, installing a loyal king, Stanisław Poniatowski, on the throne, a king who owed his crown in part to her backing. A country cannot remain independent for long when its own king's power depends on a foreign ruler. Then came the moment historians call the First Partition in 1772. Russia, Prussia and Austria simply carved off pieces of Polish territory for themselves. No major war, no dramatic siege, just an agreement among 3 neighboring powers that Poland was too weak to resist and too useful to live intact. Nearly 30% of the Commonwealth's territory vanished overnight, repainted in the colors of its neighbors. A belated push and total disappearance. Here's the ironic twist. Losing so much land finally shook Polish reformers out of their complacency. In 1791, the Commonwealth adopted one of the most progressive constitutions in the world at the time, aimed at fixing precisely the problems that had made the partition possible. A stronger central government, limits on the nobility's veto power, a more modern, functioning state. For one brief moment, it looked like Poland might reverse its decline through sheer political will. But the reform came at the worst possible time. Russia saw a stronger, more centralized Poland as a direct threat, not an improvement. Catherine the Great backed a group of conservative Polish magnates who opposed the new constitution, giving Russian troops a convenient pretext to invade under the banner of restoring the old order. Prussia, supposedly an ally, switched sides and grabbed even more territory instead of defending its neighbor. In 1793, the second partition sliced off even more of the country. Poland became a pitiful shadow of its former size, surrounded on every side and effectively reduced to a puppet state with no real independence. What happened next is one of the most heartbreaking chapters of this story. Polish general Tadeusz Kosciuszko, who by then had already fought in the American War of Independence, led a national uprising in 1794 to save what remained of the country. For a moment, ordinary peasants and soldiers rallied together in a rare show of unity. But it wasn't enough. Russian and Prussian forces crushed the uprising within a year. And this is where the map finally tears apart completely. In 1795, Russia, Prussia and Austria carried out a third and final partition. This time, they didn't just take territory, they liquidated the state entirely. No Polish king, no Polish government, no Polish army. The Commonwealth, which had once stretched across a huge swath of Eastern Europe, simply ceased to exist as a political entity. On maps from 1796, Poland wasn't there at all. Only Russian, Prussian and Austrian provinces were a country used to be. A nation underground. For most peoples, that would have been the end of the story. A conquered people usually assimilates into the empire that swallowed it within a few generations. But Poland refused to disappear culturally even after disappearing politically. The Polish language, Polish Catholic identity and Polish national memory kept being passed down from generation to generation in the occupied territories, like a secret that somehow everyone still knew. In the early 19th century, a strange flicker of hope appeared. When Napoleon swept across Europe, he crushed Prussia and created a small Polish state, the Duchy of Warsaw, partly staffed with Polish soldiers who fought loyally in his armies, hoping to win back their homeland. For a few years, something resembling Poland reappeared on the map. But then, Napoleon's empire collapsed, and at the Congress of Vienna in 1815, the victorious powers redrew Europe once again, splitting Polish lands back up between Russia, Prussia and Austria. That brief comeback turned out to be a trial run, not a resurrection. Throughout the 19th century, Poles rose up again and again, in 1830 and in 1863, trying to throw off Russian control specifically, since Russia had ended up with the largest and most tightly controlled share. Both uprisings ended in brutal crackdowns, executions, and mass exile to Siberia. Every failed uprising only tightened the occupiers' grip further. Harsher bans on the Polish language in schools, and more pressure on the Polish Catholic Church. So why didn't Poles simply turn into Russians, Germans, or Austrians after so many failures, the way many other conquered regions eventually did? Partly because the three occupying empires administered Polish territory in completely different ways, splitting families and regions between widely different administrations. That fragmentation, oddly enough, helped preserve a unique identity. Being Polish was the one thing that united people across all three occupied zones, when everything else about their situation differed. For more than a century, Poland existed almost entirely as an idea rather than a state. Polish poets, scattered across Europe in exile, wrote about a homeland their readers weren't legally allowed to call their own country. Polish families hid old maps of the Commonwealth in their attics. Children were quietly taught Polish history in secret lessons, even where the occupying government had banned it in official schools. And that's the remarkable trick of survival here. A nation kept itself alive underground, inside other people's empires, for 123 years straight. Resurrection. The turning point that finally broke this deadlock came from somewhere no one in Warsaw could control: the battlefields of the First World War. And here's where things become almost unbelievable. All three empires that had partitioned Poland, Russia, Germany, and Austria-Hungary, ended up on opposite sides of that catastrophic war. And all three ultimately lost, one way or another. Russia collapsed into revolution in 1917. Germany and Austria-Hungary were defeated and collapsed in 1918. The three powers that had erased Poland from the map lost their own grip on power within 5 years of each other. With all three occupiers suddenly weakened or gone, Polish leaders seized the moment instantly. In November 1918, Poland declared independence and restored its sovereignty for the first time since 1795. 123 years after the Third Partition wiped it off every map of Europe, Poland was back on the map, within its own borders, under its own government, for the first time in generations. That return didn't mean the rest of its modern history would be easy. The newly reborn Poland almost immediately had to fight a war against Soviet Russia to settle its eastern border. Just 20 years later, in 1939, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union invaded Poland from opposite directions, a shocking echo of the original partitions, carving up the country between them once again. World War II devastated Poland more than almost any other country in Europe, and after the war, its borders were shifted westward under Soviet influence, forcing millions of people into displacement. The trauma of that first disappearance was never fully forgotten. It shaped, and still shapes, how modern Poland views its powerful neighbors. That's why modern Polish politics still carries a deep, almost instinctive awareness toward both Russia and Germany, regardless of which political party holds power. That's why Poland pushed so hard to join NATO and the European Union as soon as it became possible after the Cold War, seeking exactly the kind of protective framework it never had in the 18th century. A country that was once partitioned, occupied for more than a century, and then divided up again within living memory, doesn't take borders, alliances, or sovereignty for granted. So why did Poland disappear from the map for 123 years? Not because its people vanished, and not because its culture died. It disappeared because flat, open geography left it with no natural defenses. Because a political system built on unanimous consent left it structurally incapable of timely reform. And because three ambitious neighboring empires found it easier to carve up a paralyzed giant than to let it recover. Poland came back for exactly the opposite reasons. Because language, faith and memory turned out to be harder to erase than borders. And because history eventually did to Russia, Germany and Austria-Hungary exactly what they had once done to Poland. A map can erase a country. But as it turns out, it can't always erase the people who remember what that country used to be.